Welcome to Dataless You. I'm Paul, coming to you from Brooklyn. Today we're going to take a look at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We're going to pay particular attention to the novel's portrait of the limitations of language in expressing moral truths. So let's get started. The fundamental question we're asking today is Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, a masterpiece of art? And if so, or if not so, why? So that is the overriding question, and I want you to hold that question in mind as we move forward. Is this book indeed a masterpiece? And if so, or if not so, why? But first, let's take a look at the life of Joseph Conrad. Here he is as a young man. He lived a rather storied life. He was born in Russia in 1857 and died in England in 1924 as an English citizen. He considered himself a Polish writer, but amazingly wrote in English after really only mastering the language in his 20s. Most importantly, notice that he served as captain of a steamer on the Congo River for a Belgian trading company. So Joseph Conrad had first-hand experience of the Belgian colonization of the Congo at the turn of the century, when much of Europe was, in fact, scrambling for Africa and imperializing. Conrad himself says that this novel represents more or less a direct account of his experience, of course with some artistic embellishments. So Conrad was there, he saw the atrocities of imperialism, and he came home and went on to write this novel in his own effort to wrap his mind around what was happening and to express his own views on the subject. So here we have an image of a steamer going upriver, and I want to just briefly give you an overview of the novel, Heart of Darkness. In this well-known novel, we hear the story of a sailor named Marlowe. Marlowe is telling his story to other sailors as they loaf around on a boat about to set sail for Africa. Marlowe tells the story of his previous trip up an unnamed river in Africa, but generally we read it as the Congo River, knowing that Conrad himself worked there and traveled there. And Marlowe's task is essentially to find a man named Kurtz, who is the head of an office deep in the jungles, and at that company office, Kurtz collects ivory, and he is rather good at doing so. In fact, it's noted that he's collected more ivory than all of the other officers combined. Kurtz is a mystery man. As Marlowe gets closer and closer to him in his journey upriver, he learns more and more, and in a way comes to understand less and less about this man, Kurtz. It turns out, when we finally do arrive to Kurtz's station and meet the man, that he's dying, that he is worshipped by the native Africans as a kind of god, that he is a larger-than-life figure who has both achieved tremendous success and become a kind of monster in the way he governs. He, for example, has severed heads on stakes stuck in the ground surrounding his little office in the jungle. And these severed heads on stakes serve as symbols of his savagery, his ferocious power. So Kurtz becomes a moral enigma for Marlowe, the sailor telling the story of his journey to find this man Kurtz and bring him home. And at the same time, Kurtz becomes a moral enigma for us, the reader. And that is the question we're going to look at today. But first, a little background on the history of the Belgian conquest of the Congo around the turn of the century. So King Leopold II of Belgium, pictured here, was a great hypocrite and monster himself. He was holding conventions in Europe, pledging to do no evil, if you will, in Africa, sort of gathering all of the great powers of the time, France, England, Germany, etc., and sort of making proclamations that they will do no harm in Africa, that they will civilize and improve the native populations by bringing industry, culture, Christianity, etc., whatever. Meanwhile, he was terrorizing the Congolese people outright. There are stories of predominantly Leopold ordering his men to sever the hands of those who failed to bring in enough ivory, or really in the Congo at this point it was rubber, that was then shipped back to Europe, made into tires and various products, and sold for a great fortune. So beware, there are some arresting images coming. Take a look here at these two young boys, each with a severed hand. So this was common practice for Leopold and his colonizing imperial gang. They would force the Congolese people, particularly the men and boys, to go out into the jungle to bring rubber back. And if they failed to bring in enough, sort of reach quota, their hands would be severed. And much, much worse was going on. I'm focusing on this one particular form of punishment, but they would cage the women and children and rape the women as the husbands were out searching for rubber. They meaning the Belgian colonizers stripped the country essentially of all of its rubber and focused so primarily on that resource that people were starving in masses. They were not allowed to farm because they had to spend their days hunting down rubber. They were not compensated, or hardly compensated, and so the entire country was starving, was dying. There was no viable economy besides this singular hunt for rubber in order to enrich the Belgian king. Here you have an image of a couple of men actually holding severed hands. So these images present the facts, and they're hard to look at and to wrap our minds around such monstrousness. And that in part is what we're talking about today. How does such a thing happen, and how then are we to judge such a thing? So Chinua Achebe, pictured here, is the grandfather of African literature, Nigerian, who wrote Things Fall Apart, a beautiful novel about Christian missionaries in Nigeria, sort of driving a village apart and wreaking its own havoc on the other side. of the continent. Achebe went on to become a widely respected man of letters, teaching across the world, and here in America, he delivered a famous lecture and published a paper in 1977 attacking Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, a revered masterpiece, quote unquote, here in the West, taught all across American high schools and universities. So this was a scandal, and today we're going to look closely at Achebe's argument and see if it holds. Here are his two main claims. Number one, Joseph Conrad was a thoroughgoing racist. That's a direct quote from the essay, from the lecture. And I'm going to grant that point to Mr. Achebe. I think if you read the novel through this lens, you see how Conrad was demonstrating a kind of classical English liberal perspective, respecting, perhaps is a strong word, the Africans in his story, but also outright portraying them as savages. He actually calls the men helping him, that is Marlowe now, helping him on his boat, cannibals. So we just sort of have a whole class of cannibals on board the ship. The Africans in the novel are not given names. They're not really characterized. They're not fully realized creations. And I think that we are safe to go ahead and grant Achebe this point, namely that Conrad was a racist. You know, we may go about offering an apologia for Conrad by sort of arguing that he was a man of his time and place, and these kinds of deep-rooted racist ideas were sort of ubiquitous. And we might take the time to assert that Conrad, on the other hand, was a rather liberal soul who did actually write this novel depicting the atrocities, and that it brought more attention to what was happening, etc., etc. He was maybe even more advanced for his time. Nevertheless, I think that if you look closely at the novel, you will see the racism that Achebe is pointing to. But let's take a look at the second claim, that the book is an offensive and deplorable one. That one, in my opinion, is more worthy of scrutiny. So let's take a look at the argument for this claim, namely that Heart of Darkness is bad art, is not art, and is deplorable. Here is an extended quotation. He begins, Africa as setting and backdrop which eliminates the African as human factor. Africa as a metaphysical battlefield devoid of all recognizable humanity, into which the wandering European enters at his peril. Can nobody see the preposterous and perverse arrogance in thus reducing Africa to the role of props for the breakup of one petty European mind? But that isn't even the point. The real question is the dehumanization of Africa and Africans, which this age-long attitude has fostered and continues to foster in the world. And the question is whether a novel which celebrates this dehumanization, which depersonalizes a portion of the human race, can be called a great work of art. My answer is no, it cannot. This quote, again, is taken from Achebe's essay, An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So, what is going on in this claim? Essentially, Achebe is arguing that this portrait of Africa, this image of Africa as one utterly devoid, as he puts it, of humanity, this image of Africa as pure savagery, as merely the scene, the setting for the degradation of one human mind, namely Kurtz's mind. So Kurtz, a fine European of great potential, wanders into the African jungle, the heart of darkness, so to speak, and is undone by the savage powers therein, specifically the Africans and their lack of humanity. I am more skeptical about this claim, and I think it's because there is a greater sophistication or complexity in the sort of ethics the inner working of ethics in this novel. And so I want to sort of unpack this claim, take a closer look at it, and we'll see. We'll see one way or another whether Achebe's argument that Heart of Darkness is in fact not even a great work of art holds water. So let's jump to the end of the story, shall we? Marlowe arrives upriver, Kurtz is dying, and he utters his famous dying words, "The horror! The horror!" And so we have these two exclamations, these two sentences, one repeating the other, and we're sort of left perplexed and wondering about the meaning of this utterance, the horror, the horror. Kurtz mutters this exclamation, and we're forced to ask a few questions. So take a look here at the questions that this phrase brings up. What are we to make of Kurtz's famous dying words? That is the fundamental question. Do they represent a moral assertion of Kurtz's? Do they represent, in other words, his passing moral judgment on either himself, on his behavior, his actions, his own life in its entirety, or perhaps on just what he has witnessed there in Africa, upriver, collecting ivory for the company? Is it a claim about European imperialism in general? We don't really know, do we? In fact, can we even read them as a proposition of any kind? That is going to be a big problem for us down the line. It's not an actual assertion. These sentences are not actual claims. There is no subject, no main verb, etc. And so we're left sort of wondering at the meaning. Okay. So, Marlowe, strangely and rather perplexingly, defends Kurtz in the end. And I think this is Achebe's great problem with the novel. How is it that our narrator comes in the end to defend Kurtz and call him, quote, a remarkable man? This does pose a problem, no? This is something we need to think about. So I want to bring you here to the lines in the novel where Marlowe is expressing his defense of Kurtz at the novel's end. Here we are. I went no more near the remarkable man, that's Kurtz, who had pronounced a judgment upon the adventures of his soul on this earth. The voice was gone. What else had there been? This is the reason why I affirm that Kurtz was a remarkable man. He had something to say. He said it. He had summed up. He had judged the horror. He was a remarkable man. After all, this was the expression of some sort of belief. It had candor. It had conviction. It had a vibrating note of revolt in its whisper. It had the appalling face of a glimpsed truth. So, in this quote, we have a lot. Let's take a closer look. I went no more near the remarkable man. So he's calling Kurtz remarkable. And why? Who had pronounced a judgment upon the adventures of his soul on this earth. So there we have Marlowe's interpretation of that exclamation, the horror. He does believe that Kurtz has judged himself, or the, quote, adventures of his soul. Okay? The voice was gone. So Marlowe is dead. Kurtz is dead. What else had there been? Kurtz was merely a voice. This is the reason why I affirm that Kurtz was a remarkable man. So we have a very clear sort of statement there saying, well, this is why I think Kurtz was okay in the end. He had something to say and he said it. So this is the value that Marlowe is pointing to at the novel's end. As hard as it may be for us to read such an estimation, for some reason, and we're going to figure out why, Marlowe says he had something to say, and he said it, and that, to me, is remarkable. He had summed up, he had judged the horror. He was a remarkable man. After all, this was the expression of some sort of belief. So here we have Marlowe digging a little deeper and uncovering that Kurtz had a belief here, namely that the adventures of his soul were in totality a horror. And that this belief had candor, honesty, it had conviction. And then we see the prose sort of fade into a kind of poetry. It had a vibrating note of revolt in its whisper. You hear the poetry in that line. It had the appalling face of a glimpsed truth. Truth, even. So Kurtz's exclamation, according to Marlowe, is an expression here of truth, if only glimpsed. Let's see how that has come to pass. We have to pull back now, and we have to look at how language operates in Heart of Darkness in general. First off, this is a framed narrative in that the entire novel is essentially in quotation marks because it's delivered to us, it's told to us through the voice of Marlowe, the sailor just sort of lying about in a boat, telling other sailors this old story. And there's interruptions in the narrative every now and then, after some maybe particularly horrible moment in the story. Marlowe, pauses, and we just sort of are back to these other sailors loafing around on a boat waiting to set sail. The importance of the frame narrative is it puts the story into the mouth of a man, and it shows that this man Marlowe is delving back into this story. It's his only story. And he's told it before, and he tells it again and again and again and at great length. Why? Because the telling of the story for Marlowe is his own journey into the Heart of Darkness. He needs to wrap his mind around Kurtz, the monster, the demigod, the powerful man. And he needs to figure it out. And it's in telling the story, in expressing it in the use of language that he believes will help him do so, right? And so each time Marlowe sets out to tell this story, to tell some other man what he saw, what he witnessed, we feel his efforts to attempt to come to some sort of clarity about Kurtz and essentially about the Heart of Darkness in mankind. Furthermore, Kurtz is portrayed as a voice. He's called a word. He was just a word for me. And that is important, right? So Kurtz is almost not real in the physical, bodily sense. He's this abstract voice, right? He himself is just a bit of language, the word Kurtz. As he's going upriver, Marlowe says, that was exactly what I had been looking forward to, a talk with Kurtz. You see, if he could just talk with the man, maybe he could figure all of this out. Again, language as this vehicle of arriving at moral truths. We're going to dig at it and hopefully get to the bottom of something. Now, the problem is, in the novel, language fails us. It fails Marlowe. And there are some very interesting moments in the novel where Conrad shows this. So, for example, there is this device he uses called delayed decoding, which is sort of a fancy literary term for showing us the inner workings of a man's consciousness, sort of in real time as he perceives certain phenomena, right? I'm going to bring you to a rather extended passage of this delayed decoding on page 26. I'm working out of the Bantam Classic, so my page numbers are referring to this version. If you want to do the ratio breakdown, my book is 132 pages, so if you're working out of your own, you can kind of figure it out from there. But let's go to page 26. I'm going to read an extended quote. And what I want you to pay attention to is how we come upon something, and it's described to us very, very intricately, but we don't know what it is until just a bit later. A few sentences later, we learn what this more ambiguous description was portraying. Okay? And that's the delay in the decoding. The decoding is, I see what I see now. But Conrad shows us that when we see something, our minds try to sort of wrap themselves around the image, and we describe it, but there's always this delay. And the argument here is that this delayed decoding actually mirrors the larger delayed decoding, in that Marlowe's trying to tell the story. He's trying to get at the essential crux of who Kurtz is, of that heart of darkness, and there's always this delay. He can never quite get there. Here's the quote. So Marlowe's coming up the bank. He's docked the ship, and he's at a station. Not quite Kurtz's station. He's downriver still, but here we are. Black shapes crouched, lay, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced within the dim light, and all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. Another mine on the cliff went off, followed by a slight shudder of the soil under my feet. The work was going on, the work. And this was the place where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die. You see, it's not till the end of the paragraph that we see that these, quote, black shapes crouched are dying workers, Native Africans, literally worked to death. And what I notice in looking at these moments of delayed decoding is, more often than not, they're moments of Marlowe perceiving some moral abomination, right? Men worked to death, left under a tree to die by the company, by the European imperial invaders, by Kurtz and his men and his ilk. I'm going to go on. They were dying slowly. It was very clear. So now it's clear, right? They were not enemies. They were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now. Nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. Brought from all the recesses of the coast and all the legality of time contracts, lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed on unfamiliar food, they sickened, became inefficient, and were then allowed to crawl away and rest. These moribund shapes were free as air and nearly as thin. I began to distinguish the gleam of the eyes under the trees. Then, glancing down, I saw a face near my hand. The black bones reclined at full length with one shoulder against the tree, and slowly the eyelids rose and the sunken eyes looked up at me, enormous and vacant, a kind of blind white flicker in the depths of the orbs which died out slowly. Marlowe sees something deplorable, and his mind takes time to describe it, to wrap itself around such an image, such a fact. And that, to me, begins now to show us the limitations of language, and that this is a theme in Conrad. That language only does so much, and often in a delayed fashion. And that this is going to become problematic when we again return to try to evaluate Kurtz's claim, the har. So I would encourage you to take a look at some other moments. I've got them up here on the big board of delayed decoding in the novel. There's a famous one where, as Marlowe approaches Kurtz's station, they're attacked essentially by the natives who are shooting arrows. And at first he says, little sticks. What are these little sticks? And it's only about half a page later where he says, arrows, by Jove, we're being shot at, that he realizes that he's under attack. And then the heads on stakes surrounding Kurtz's office, which I mentioned earlier, present another really poignant moment of Marlowe sort of looking at these things and saying, like, what the? not being able to sort of see them at first. So again, the delay in the decoding of the phenomenological perception. These moments begin to present a view of language and of its limitations that I believe point to what Conrad is driving at the novel's end, and why we just may be able to understand, at least, if not agree with. I mean, in no way am I sort of offering my own judgments here. I'm just sort of trying to see what's operating in the novel that allows us maybe to read this final estimation of Marlowe's upon Kurtz and say, well, okay, maybe, right? Why? And I think the limitations of language is a very important part of the story. There's another notion or aspect of language's limits, and that's in, I've already sort of described how Kurtz is a voice. He's described variously as a poet, as a musician, as a great talker and leader of men. At a point, someone says he could lead any party, and they say, "What kind of party?" An extreme party, you know. He's one of these guys who seems like he could stand up and give a speech and lead anyone and everyone to do anything and everything, right? And that's a problem. This is problematic. This is, again, the problem with language. Essentially, how rhetoric can be so deceiving is the point here. That language ultimately betrays us. You know, Kurtz is sort of babbling on his deathbed, talking about things like live rightly, and that we always have to have the right motive always in what we do. And so he's presented as this man of lofty and noble ideas, but at the same time we know that he's a kind of monster who has murdered, who has worked men to death, who is at the end of his life is so possessive of his ivory that he doesn't even believe it's the company's anymore. You know, he's become so caught up in how he's been deified by the natives and how he's just amassed such riches that it's gone to his head, right? And you know, this is kind of the traditional narrative that the Heart of Darkness is about a man going mad. He goes into the deep jungle and he goes crazy, right? But look at this quote here about language's betrayal. A voice, referring to Kurtz. It survived his strength to hide in the magnificent folds of eloquence the barren darkness of his heart. The waste of his weary brain were haunted by shadowy images now, images of wealth and fame revolving obsequiously round his inextinguishable gift of noble and lofty expression. In other words, Kurtz's ability to articulate lofty ideas, noble sentiments, actually obscures the darkness of his deeds, of his behavior. You see, so his ability to speak and to bedazzle us with words, to seduce us with his eloquence, hides the truth of his moral monstrosity. And that's a problem. I mean, this is a serious problem that we have with language. I think here that Conrad is showing us that ultimately language does a poor job of conveying moral truths, right? And so all of this is a part. Language is limited, right? No matter how many times Marlowe tells the story, he's always driving at something, and it's some truth that no matter how many times he tells the story, he can never quite grasp, right? And then we have that delayed decoding, right? So we see things like, even for you, when you saw those images earlier of severed hands, right? Your mind, your consciousness is trying to describe it to yourself, and probably doing a poor job of it ultimately, right? And then ultimately we see that Kurtz's rhetoric is empty and is merely something that obscures what's really going on underneath. So, This brings me to the end of the lecture. I want to present now 3 different moral views of the universe. All right, and then we're going to sort of map these views onto what happens here at the end of the novel and come to some final conclusion on is Heart of Darkness a masterpiece of art and why? Look here at the big board. We have classical objectivism. This is a type of ethical view that states that propositions are true or false regardless of culture, language, time, or personal attitude. So, for example, if you make the assertion genocide is bad, you can say that that is a true assertion regardless of time, culture, language, and personal attitude, right? It's objectively true. It is true always and forever according to some sort of categorical imperative. Okay, so that's classical objectivism. And then you have cultural relativism, which says propositions are true or false only within a certain cultural group. So, for example, the assertion polygamy is wrong. You know, we may believe that, but there may be other groups in the past or in other continents that think that polygamy is just fine, and so that is cultural relativism. And finally, most importantly, we have moral subjectivism. Propositions are true or false, but they only express the attitude of the person expressing the view. So, and we have, for example, the Kurtz line, "My life has been a horror show." So, essentially, what I'm arguing here is that Heart of Darkness is a masterpiece of art, and it's because it shows us, perhaps, that the only valid moral view in the end is actually moral subjectivism. As much as we might want to believe in classical objectivism or cultural relativism, right? As much as we might want to agree with Achebe and condemn this book for being racist and deplorable, perhaps what redeems the book is that it shows us, through Kurtz and through Marlowe's telling the story, that the only real moral view, or the only valid one, is a kind of moral subjectivism. Again, I don't want anyone watching this lecture to come to the conclusion that I believe that the only valid view is moral subjectivism. I want to make this disclaimer very clear. I'm merely arguing that I think Heart of Darkness does a good job of showing how moral subjectivism may be all that we have. Okay, and let's see why. Subjectivism makes the claim that our mental activity is the only indubitable fact of our experience. Right? So there's nothing else we can trust but what happens in our minds. Keep in mind, ethical propositions can be true or not true. This isn't some sort of ultimate relativism or ethical view that says, well, no moral claims can be true or false. They absolutely can. Only the truth or falsity of an ethical claim expresses the attitude of the person making the claim. In other words, Marlowe, Chinua Achebe, myself, you, none of us can be Kurtz and pronounce judgment upon his life. We can make our own judgments, but they're true just for us, right? So Achebe believes it's a racist and deplorable novel. Fine, that's true for him. But can we come to some objective claim? Can we all agree, indubitably that that's true? I don't know. Is there a kind of cultural relativism that we can apply here? You know, we talked earlier about Conrad being sort of a paradigm of this sort of liberal English turn of the century view, and that he was essentially a decent man, maybe a little racist, but maybe less so given his time and place, etc. Right? But perhaps what the novel shows us is that moral propositions are only true for the person expressing them, right? And let me bring you back to Marlowe's defense of Kurtz. Let's take one last look at this quote. He says that he was a remarkable man because he had pronounced a judgment upon the adventures of his soul on this earth. And I think that is the single most important fact here. That Marlowe, despite all his confusion about Kurtz, I mean, Marlowe, you can find plenty of passages where he's pretty repulsed by this man, Yes, he's also somewhat in awe of him, and he's heard so many men tell him how great Kurtz is, and he sees the natives worshiping him. He literally witnesses that. Kurtz is an enigma, and he's as much an enigma, an inscrutable enigma, as the land, the jungle, the heart of darkness, upriver itself. And I think that is what's at work here. That ultimately the human heart is inscrutable. It is powerful and monstrous, and that perhaps when fully expressed, it eludes comprehension. And at the end of the day, only a man can pass judgment on himself. And I believe that that's what Marlowe's saying. Because then, again, look, this is the reason I affirm that Kurtz was a remarkable man. He had something to say. He said it. He summed up. He had judged the heart. He was a remarkable man. After all, this was the expression of some sort of belief. So we're back to this notion that this expression, the horror, represents his own judgment, Kurtz's own judgment upon himself. It had candor, it had conviction, and then this poetry, the vibrating note of revolt in its whisper. Perhaps he's revolting against his own life, his own behavior. It had the appalling face of a glimpsed truth. He finally glimpses his life in its entirety, and he says, wow, that has been a horror show. And to Marlowe, that's enough. And perhaps it's because Marlowe, whether he's sort of aware of it or not, affirms the view of moral subjectivism. That moral claims can only be true or false for the person expressing the claim. And that at the end of the day, even if I say genocide is bad, all that does is express my personal attitude on the matter, and not any larger claim or objective truth. So, as we look here at an image of Joseph Conrad, I would like to return to the question that we began with. Is Heart of Darkness a masterpiece of art? And if so, why? I believe that Achebe has excellent points, and his essay is highly recommended. But I cannot go along with him when he argues that the novel is not a great work of art. For the reasons I've tried to argue today, namely that the novel presents an excellent portrait of moral subjectivism. As abhorrent as that view may be to you, it does show us how, if language is limited and ultimately unable to convey moral truths, and if moral propositions, moral assertions, essentially at the end of the day only express the attitude of the person expressing the view, then this novel does a fairly good job of showing how that works, of showing the limits of language, and of actually passing judgment on a man, as abhorrent as we may find him, that is maybe valid if we hold that is the only way one passes judgment in this world, namely upon oneself. So, in conclusion, I encourage you to pick it up. Pick up Heart of Darkness. Give it a read. It's short. As I said, my version is 132 pages. And read it through this lens. Watch Marlowe try to wrap his own mind around this inscrutable Kurtz living in the heart of the inscrutable earth. And see if you agree. See if you see in the novel this sort of relentless effort to show how language is limited, how it ultimately cannot convey moral truths from one person to another. In other words, really can't communicate them so much as merely express them and express the attitude of the individual making a claim one way or another. And then when you see Kurtz at the end say, "The horror! The horror!" maybe we understand the weight, the complexity, and the import of that exclamation. Okay, that's all for now. I thank you for joining me here as we looked at Joseph Conrad's masterpiece, Heart of Darkness.